Howdy y'all, Christi here with Little Salty Homesteader. Welcome back to my YouTube channel and welcome into the tomato patch of my garden. Today, today's video is going to basically be a recap of my tomato season for this year. I like to do these every year so I can kind of look back and remember what went wrong, what went well, what I need to work on for the next season and so on, because tomatoes are probably the most important crop that I grow within my North Texas vegetable garden. So let's go ahead and get started with all of that. Thank you guys for joining me today. This is my first year with these raised beds here within this tomato patch. There's 3 of them. In previous years, I have grown tomatoes in grow bags and 5-gallon buckets. So this year was definitely kind of a learning year in terms of switching over from container gardening to raised bed gardening for the tomatoes. That being said, a lot of things did go really well. There were some things that didn't, and then some stuff that I will improve upon for next year. But for the things that went well, because I'm growing in the raised beds now, I had a ton of room for companion plants like basil, marigolds, dill. I have cowpeas in here that are still hanging around and kicking out peas for me. Calendula, sweet alyssum. I had all kinds of companion plants planted in between and around all of the tomatoes. So what that did was it actually helped reduce the number of pests that I deal with in my typical tomato garden. Now, in years past, I have had a ton of hornworms. We're talking 2 to 3 dozen hornworms that I have come out and picked off and gotten rid of. This year I had 10 total for the entire season, including current moments. So drastic improvement because I was able to fit more companion plants in. So that was a huge bonus for me because hornworms gross me out more than any other worm or insect. Those, okay. So compared to years past, much fewer hornworms, fantastic. Also, trellising, you can see right here, these trellises right here, is much easier in raised beds compared to their grow bags and buckets because I can simply install T-posts and run a Florida weave trellis all the way down in between the plants. Now, did I keep up with it? No, that's kind of one of the things that I need to work on next year, is doing a better job at trellising. But it is a lot easier in the raised beds because I can utilize this Florida weave method and trellis really quickly and effectively. This year was also the first year that I was actually able to preserve tomatoes outside of freezing and dehydrating. This year I was able to can tomatoes for the first time ever since I was a kid helping my grandmother. This is my first time on my own. So I was able to preserve fire roasted tomatoes, crushed tomatoes, and diced tomatoes. All of the, well, most of them are still in my pantry. I have been utilizing them to make pizza sauce and curries and other things, but those are there, first time ever, really excited. I think I preserved about 16 pints of tomatoes. I'd have to look back on my preservation log to get a full tally, but I was quite happy with that because that's 16 pints that I don't have to buy at the store. And also I do have half of a quart of dehydrated cherry tomatoes in the pantry for use within the winter months if I just need to add something to a soup or a sauce to give it a little bit of a tomato flavor. I also made dehydrated tomato powder using the skins of the tomatoes that I canned. That tomato powder can be used to make tomato paste. It can also be used as seasoning and other flavoring type things. So overall, really good preservation year for tomatoes. I know that many other people have just dozens and dozens of jars of preserved tomatoes, but considering this is my first year, I am really excited and really happy with what I was able to accomplish in terms of preserving. Also, if you can see right here, I have several tomato plants that are still left from my initial spring planting that are currently setting fruit. So I will get a fall run of tomatoes. Now, I may have to harvest some green and let them ripen indoors, or figure out how to preserve green tomatoes, but these guys are definitely setting fruit, and I'm really excited about that too. So really good positives for the tomato garden season this year, but let's go ahead and talk about some of the negatives. There's only a few, but you know, because I'm still learning how to transition from that container to the raised bed, there's definitely some stuff that I will need to work on for next year. So the first negative was that several of my plants got sick really early on. The way that I divided up my tomato plants was this bed right here, where this giant basil is, had cherry tomatoes along the back side. This bed had my slicers and paste tomatoes, and then the front bed that's over there that you can't really see in this footage had my really large beefsteak and ox heart tomatoes. So the cherry tomatoes all got sick really fast and really early, and then those beefsteak and ox hearts as well. Now, I'm not too surprised about the beefsteak tomatoes getting sick early, because Texas isn't the greatest place to try to grow really big tomatoes. It just isn't. We get way too hot and way too humid way too fast. So those really big tomatoes really struggle to set the fruit and ripen it in time before the weather gets too ridiculous for them. So I'm not surprised about those. I was surprised about the cherry tomatoes, because typically cherry tomatoes are the ones that will produce throughout the summer into the fall, but I don't have any cherry tomatoes left at all for my fall garden. So what these got sick with was initially spider mites. Once the spider mites took over, then the blight moved in. Typically, once your plant starts to get weak, that's whenever diseases can come much quicker and much more prolific. So after the spider mites really were too heavy within those plants, then it made it really easy and susceptible for the blight to move in, and it just wiped them out. So I haven't had cherry tomatoes since July, I think. Most of the beefsteak and ox heart I cut down in June, and then this bed that had the slicers and the paste tomatoes, some of those were determinate, so once they set all their fruit and all of that got ripe, I removed them anyway because they weren't going to do anything else. But then there were a few others that did eventually get sick with blight, which is very common here in North Texas. So the fact that I have 5 or 6 plants left, despite all of the different blight issues, is really good. Additionally, in these 2 beds, the front bed and the middle bed, I grew tomatoes in 2 rows so that I could get more tomato plants in, but unfortunately that was way too densely planted, at least in this middle bed here. What happened was the plants were so thick and so dense, they were like growing all over each other and through each other. There was no light that reached the middle of the bed, which was where a lot of the companion plants were planted. The basil, the marigolds, all of those things were planted down the middle, so they weren't getting sunlight, so they weren't able to grow to be able to do those pest repelling benefits and improve the flavor of tomatoes and all those wonderful things that companion plants do. So most of the hornworms that I got were actually in this middle bed for that very reason. There were 3 hornworms in that very front bed and none at all in this back bed. The 3 hornworms that were in that very front bed were on the single tomato plant that was on this corner here. I can't remember which plant it was, but it got cut down early. I didn't even get a single tomato off of it. So anyway, because this was so densely planted down the middle, it had those determinate tomatoes that you don't really want to prune, and I also decided I wasn't going to prune this year just to see what happened. No light reached the middle, which kind of choked out all of those companion plants. So that was a negative that happened. And then, even though the trellising is easier in the raised beds, I did not keep up with it very well at all. After about mid-May or so, end of May, these tomatoes just went wild at the very beginning of June. Into May, beginning of June, we had like 13 inches of rain in a single week, and it was just wet and soggy. And then the tomatoes just grew so quickly after that. I didn't even try to tame the wild mess that it became. And so that was a hard lesson that I had to learn this year, was even though you're in raised beds, even though you started the trellising, you have to continue on with it. And what I found later on in the season is if I put individual stakes by the tomatoes, it helps to provide them a little bit more support, and it makes this trellising a little bit tighter so that it doesn't droop and sag. So in going forward, that's one of the things that I'm going to improve upon, is making sure that each individual plant has its own stake next to it, and I'm going to incorporate that within the Florida weave. And I'm still gonna use these T-posts, of course, because they're nice and hardy and much more robust than the stakes that are by the individual plants. Another thing that I'm going to improve upon next year is, especially in this middle bed here where my slicers and paste and most of my determinate varieties go, I'm not going to plant a double rows of tomatoes. I'm just going to focus on one single row, and I'm probably not going to have as many beefsteak next year. I'll just kind of have 2 beds of the slicer paste tomatoes, just single rows of each. And then of course my cherry tomatoes will still be back here. I'm also going to move these eggplants that are right here into the very front bed so that they'll kind of be out into the yard instead of getting into the way of the row, because I can't even get all the way down this row now because these eggplants are so big. The other thing that I'm going to improve upon for next year is I'm going to put a heavier focus on hybrid varieties. This year and years past, my main focus has been heirlooms, because there's so many different beautiful heirlooms and I felt like I needed to grow them all. Unfortunately, that doesn't always equal the most prolific tomato plants, and my goal is to feed my family from my garden. So while I am still going to have some heirlooms because they're simply so beautiful, or I love them so much, I'm going to put more hybrids in here so that those preservation things that I was really excited about this year, I can do even more of next year. There will, like I said, there will still be some heirlooms because I just love them so much, like the Sart Reloy. I'm not even sure how you say that correctly. I say it wrong in every video, but that one is the yellow one with the purple shoulders. I'm going to continue to grow that one. Thorburns Terracotta, I'm going to continue to grow that one. But other than that, I am really going to focus more on the hybrid side of the tomato world, so that I can get lots of tomatoes put away into my pantry. And I don't have any salsa preserved. I've been using my canned tomatoes to just make salsa as I want to eat it, but I would like to have some salsa put back in there so that when I'm just hangry and need a snack, I have that salsa ready to go and I don't have to make it right away. But that's, yeah. So right here, I'm going to put in a few pictures, kind of a picture slideshow of the tomato season this year, so you can kind of see the progression from when I planted them at the end of March through where they kind of just took over and became a jungle in the garden. Some of the different harvest bowls that I had, whatever photos I have. I'm just gonna do a real quick slideshow here for just a little bit, and then I will wrap this video up talking about the tomatoes that produced the most and then the tomatoes that were the most disappointing. the tomatoes that were the most productive tomatoes in my garden this year, the first one, this one is still producing for me now. It has several that have set fruit, is going to be the Porter tomato. Now this one is a variety that was developed in East Texas, so it makes sense that it does well for me here in North Texas. This one has stood up against humidity, drought, intense rains, pests, mostly spider mites. I've only had one hornworm on that Porter, but like I said, that was the companion plant issue that I had. And everything else that the crazy Texas weather has thrown at it, it has handled just fine. It went absolutely wild and grew 17 different directions within the garden. And I have a trellis up now, but it's still growing kind of wild. But this one, every time that I harvested tomatoes, I harvested Porters every single time. So that one was definitely my most productive tomato. Many of the tomatoes that are preserved in my pantry are because of the Porter. I will say it is smaller. It's kind of like a cocktail sized tomato. So whenever you are canning them, it does get kind of tedious peeling all those kind of small tomatoes. But I'm going to continue to grow it because it has kept me in tomatoes all year long, or all season long. There was a bit of a break between July and now in terms of not really having any ripe tomatoes, but that's okay because it's setting fruit again and I'll have more ripe tomatoes soon. But it has been so prolific and so dynamic and so wild and unruly. That one was definitely the top showstopper that I had this year. Another top producer that I had was Super Sue. Now I grew this one strictly for salsa because it is a more acidic tasting tomato and we don't like our salsa to taste too sweet. We like to be able to taste the spiciness within our salsa. So I grew this one for salsa purposes. I did make fresh salsa with the Super Sue. It is also part of the reason why I have so many canned tomatoes in my pantry. This tomato is just a well-rounded slicer, probably about this big, your typical slicer size that you would find in the grocery store. However, it does have that more acidic, more robust flavor profile, way better than grocery store tomatoes. But it was a really prolific plant as well. And then the other prolific guy, the other top producer that I had this year is actually kind of surprising because this is the third time that I've attempted to grow it and I haven't had success before. But it is the Arkansas Traveler. That one is also still growing in my garden. All three of these are still growing right here. And it is currently setting fruit actually. And I was able to harvest several tomatoes off of this plant and well-rounded, just, you know, your typical slicer tomato, the one that you want to slice up and put on your hamburgers or your sandwiches. It's just a great well-rounded tomato that you can apply across many different uses. Now, there were two tomatoes that I really had high hopes for that actually were absolutely, completely disappointing this year. Now, one of them actually made my will not grow again list, and the other one I'm undecided if I'm going to grow it again, simply because I'm a nerd and it's kind of a nerdy tomato. So the most disappointing tomato in my garden this year was the Japanese black truffle. Now it did set fruit, but it did not set many. It got sick early, it got spider mites early, and it just succumbed to diseases way too quickly, and it did not produce enough tomatoes to merit taking up that much space within my garden. The tomato tasted all right. It wasn't anything special. So that one is the one that made my will not grow again list. The one that was really disappointing, but I'm unsure about, is the Rebel Starfighter Prime tomato. Now, in terms of an absolutely beautiful, stunning tomato, Rebel Starfighter Prime is it. It's an ox heart shape, it's multicolored, it has different little speckles on it. It's absolutely stunning. It tastes so wonderful. The reason why I'm disappointed in it is because out of 2 plants, I got 4 tomatoes. And the plants were so wispy and like, they weren't sick necessarily. They were just wispy. Like these plants here are bushy and leafy and wild and overgrown. The Rebel Starfighter Prime never reached any type of bushy, leafy, overgrown status. The leaves were kind of far apart, and it didn't really put shade onto the tomatoes as they were growing. So some of the tomatoes that did grow ended up with sun scald because they didn't have any protection. I didn't prune my tomatoes this year, so it wasn't from over pruning or anything. It was just a really wispy plant, and once it got hot, that was it. They actually died on their own. I didn't cut them down, but because they are Rebel Starfighter Prime and are part of the Star Wars line of tomatoes, I'm unsure if I'm going to grow them again. I have 2 other Star Wars tomatoes that I plan on trying out next year, and I feel like I need like the whole trifecta in order to keep things, you know, to complete the full experiment of Star Wars tomatoes. I feel like I need to grow all 3 together, all 3 that I have. There's several other types that I don't have, but just kind of undecided still on that one. But that was my tomato season this year. Overall, I'm really happy with it, even though there's definitely some stuff that can be improved upon next year. But if you liked this video and you want more end of season recaps for other things that I'm growing within my garden, please like and subscribe and comment and do all those different YouTube things. But until next time, go find a way to get those garden manicures. Bye!